Good afternoon, everyone. Our next panel is called Navigating the New Normal, AI-Driven Strategies for Supply Chain Resilience. I am pleased to welcome our speakers to the stage. Our moderator for today is Eric Britton, Managing Director and CEO of Fathom Consulting, all the way from London. Our panelists are Ike Harris, Vice President for Government Strategy at Exiger, Jonathan Prince, Chief Marketing Officer at Altana, and Ram Benzian, Founder and CEO of Ultra Information Solutions. Please join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage. I will turn it over to Eric, our moderator, in a moment, but one last thing first. If you like what you hear today and you want to engage further with these gentlemen and their companies, I will flag for you that each of them has a booth on the floor. Also, Exiger has a demo today at 1:30 on Stage West, right over there. And Altana has a demo tomorrow at 1:30 here on Stage East. So please make time to attend both of those and to visit each of these companies at their booths. And with that, I will turn it over to Eric.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you very much, Liza. Can everybody hear me? Is this working? Thank you. Thank you, Liza. Wonderful to be here. Thanks for attending, everybody. Navigating the new normal. What is the new normal? I think that's a good place to start. And to help us understand what we mean by the new normal, let's start from what the old normal perhaps looked like. And I've got a graphic here that I'm going to show you that maybe will help us think about that. What's the old normal? The old normal is a world where the two principal economic powers, the US and China, any guesses how they're represented in this graphic? There's going to be the blue and the red circle there. Every other bubble in this diagram is a country. The size of the bubble denotes its GDP. So you've got the two principal economic powers in either corner here, and everyone else in a kind of state of flux flowing in the space between those two corners. That's, as it were, the old normal. The world is not going to stay like that, however. What's the new normal going to look like? The new normal, we're going to crank up the level of tension around the world, and various countries are going to coalesce into one or other of the blue or the red corners like that. This is a high state of tension now that we're in. The high state of tension might be triggered by, for example, China invading Taiwan. How do we think about navigating that world? What do your supply chains look like in that world? Are you dependent on countries that are now in the red corner for critical supplies in this new normal world? How on earth do we think about it? We could use some help. We could use some help from intelligent parties, humans, and artificial intelligence too. And that's what the setup of this session is. How can AI help us think about that world and navigating that world? This, for example, is one large country that remains in the grey zone, even in a state of high tension, according to our analysis. That's to say, India. You can see the size of India there. You can also see on this map who are the closest substitutes for India. Say you're reliant on India in this world and you're concerned that your supply is going to be interrupted. Where could you get the same stuff from? And we've picked out there the three countries that would do it. Greece, Lithuania, Netherlands, interestingly enough, are the three closest substitutes for India. This is high-level macro stuff. What we really need is granular information on individual supply chains for individual companies, for countries who are concerned about critical materials and sensitive kinds of products. Thinking those through in detail is going to require an enormous amount of intelligence, including artificial intelligence, which is the purpose of this panel. Thank you very much. So, navigating myself down to the seat away from there. I'm delighted to be joined by my co-panelists here, and I've got a couple of questions just to throw to them to open up the discussion. I'm going to start with you, Jonathan, if I may.
Please.
The way the geopolitical landscape is evolving suggests a redrawing of supply chains, which I just alluded to in these preceding slides. Which sectors, in your opinion, are the most likely to be affected? And can you tell us why you got to that conclusion?
For sure. So when you think about supply chains being redrawn as a result of geopolitical conflict, I think it's helpful to take a step back and think about why particular categories are coming under pressure. And in my mind, there are really two distinct categories of supply chains that are coming under particular pressure. There are those things that have a direct effect on national security, economic security, that great powers view as conveying advantage or disadvantage in great power conflict. And then there's a second set of categories, which are really kind of more wider and value-based categories. So if you look at the first category, look, there are straight up sectors where great powers are competing for dominance, full stop. That's rare earth metals, batteries, semiconductors, artificial intelligence, hardware, all the things that we all know about. And then, of course, there's a trickle down effect that comes out of all of those technologies as second and third order products move into the more consumer space. On the other side, there are these values-based initiatives. You see, obviously, particularly with regard to climate, deforestation, global warming, but also with regard to modern slave labor, workers' rights, things like that. And of course, there's overlap with the first category. You see that in particular, obviously, with what's happening in Xinjiang and forced labor there and how that plays out in geopolitics. But on those issues, there's a special pressure, I think, on certain agricultural commodities, the way they're being made, the way they're being harvested, the way they're being processed. And so we see that in cotton, we see it in palm oil, we see it in rubber. And then the last category, which is a separate grouping, but it really, I think, demonstrates how, just as in the kind of security space, the electronic space, you're going to see trickle down into more consumer goods. Similarly, in the agricultural space, you'll see that. There's a third category that really opens up the possibilities for even broader and broader impacts, which is changing logistics modalities. So as we're concerned about great power conflict and we're concerned about particular supply lines and chains and what they mean to our security, we also have to be concerned with how those goods make it to our shores, right? And so as increasingly you see consolidation in shipping and ports and logistics, you see, 90% of all shipping goes through global maritime shipping. The United States doesn't own any of the 10 major container ships. China owns the fourth biggest. Taiwan owns 2 others. They're making bigger and bigger ships. That means that they can only offload at bigger and bigger ports. So you're getting more and more consolidation. Those routes are getting consolidated. And as governments look to ensure the security of the supply chains that bring those critical goods to their shores, you're going to see changes there. And those changes will also have further ripple effect, I think, into more consumer areas.
Fascinating. So the critical technologies is one, agricultural products is another, and logistics, the logistics of how you move those things around is your third category.
And again, as you're always looking at emerging supply chains, I would suggest that it's important to look at what underlies that sense of conflict that is causing those supply chains to be redrawn.
And is there stuff from you guys from Altana that helps people think about how that might play out, and tools that would help?
We at Altana certainly we have the ability to give you a deep sense of how your supply chains are shifting, how they're moving, and how they can be re-engineered to make them more efficient and more secure. So we're not going. I wasn't going to go straight into full pitch land, but Altana, as you know, has built the only dynamic, intelligent map of the global supply chain. So as supply chains are shifting and changing in real time, the Altana map is able to reflect that and to give you specialized AI models that can help you find risk across compliance, sourcing, procurement, insurance, finance, and then allow you to take collaborative action across the network of your extended distribution network and your extended supply network to mitigate those concerns.
Okay, great. That's super interesting. Ram, next question for you, if that's okay. And I think you've got some slides maybe to show us too. Supply chains are organic and will likely regrow in response to market pressures that might evolve when we're in this de-risked or bifurcated type of world. How could you deploy AI to monitor those changes as they occur in real time? How would you go about doing that?
So I think that what AI allows us to do is check everything, right? Unlike before. And to illustrate the importance of checking everything, I would like to ask our audience a question. by raise of hand, how many of you are cheating on your husband or wife? Seriously. So that's the point, right? When people have something to hide, they'll hide it. And if you don't check everything and everyone independently from a comprehensive set of data sources, you end up missing the important parts. And what we're trying to do is to provide both government and commercial entities with the ability to automatically check everyone and everything. And I want to show you 2 examples how this is playing out. And it doesn't really matter what sector you're about. The challenges are the same. So walk with me.
You know, it's possible no one here has anything to hide, just to be clear.
You can't prove otherwise.
We want to give everyone the benefit of the doubt.
So China, right? It doesn't matter if it's cotton, tomato paste, or EVs. The pattern is consistent. Stuff that is made using forced labor will make its way through mainland proxies to a third country and then into the US. That is the design. The fact that we're able, through excellent tools like Altanas and Exeger, to find all the different links in the supply chain allows us to expose that. But you need to be able to go beyond and see what is it that they're trying to hide, because it's not always visible if you don't have access to diverse data sources. What we're trying to do is to independently verify, not just from trade or databases that are structured, but from unstructured sources, what are they trying to hide? So here, CALB, the 3rd largest battery manufacturer in the world, right, is hiding forced labor in the supply chain. Is hiding the fact that they're sourcing from Xinjiang, from a location that is known to be associated with forced labor, from a third-party refinery that has been reported of huge violations or difficult violations of human rights. So it's not just about who's connected to who, but what they're doing there and what they're trying to hide. Similarly, it's not just about the companies, but when the transactions don't make sense. So assuming nobody, it doesn't make sense. When a company in the US out of a residential address is buying men's pants from a company in China that does hardware and construction components, it doesn't make sense. And what we're able to pick up in these cases is the parts that don't add up and show you that what they're hiding is fentanyl precursor. Nobody's flagging themselves as the supplier of fentanyl, be it from Mexico, Canada, or straight to the US. But if you're able to look beyond what is advocated, you'll find the transaction methods, and they're hiding the payment methods, the communication methods, and the fact that there's no real legitimate explanation to a transaction between a resident in the US and a company in China to do this. So our view of AI is check everything, verify independently from multiple data sources, and then when it doesn't make sense, flag it. This is something that is beyond human capacity and is unlocked by new technologies.
Thank you. That's admirably timely and very interesting too. Where that takes my mind is, I guess you're all familiar with Whack-A-Mole, right? The game where you have to hit a mole and another one pops up and you have to hit that too. That feels to me like the way humans go at this type of problem, right? I see the issue. I suspect there's fentanyl in that chain somewhere and it's coming from China. I hit that mole, and while I'm hitting it, another root has already regrown, and my slow human mind has got to transition and make a policy that will hit the new mole too. And what you're telling us is there are ways that are nimbler and more intelligent than that, quicker than that can be deployed using AI, maybe that can capture that before the next mole pops his head out, maybe, or
they'll continue popping. It takes 10 seconds to flag them, so it's all right.
Okay then. Great. Thank you, Ram. Ike, the next question for you. Companies and countries looking to thrive in this new bifurcated or de-risked world will need robust supply chain strategies, including alternative sources for critical materials or components. How could AI help with those strategies?
Yeah, thank you. So I think the easiest the one word answer is data, right? So, one of the things we've talked about already, and I think the third dimension is regulation. So as you had this great graphic on, by the way, that was a fantastic graphic. But it showed, you're going to have these bifurcated systems, but they're not going to be completely separated, right? So this sort of de-risk versus decouple is kind of it's a fiction. It's never going to actually happen. So as countries move to, shore up their supply chains, they're going to implement new regulations on a dynamic basis. They're all going to be different. So even in that, that sphere of the U.S. influence, there's going to be a host of different regulations about what can and can't be imported from Xinjiang or on semiconductor exports or whatever the new, Wassenaar next export control regime is. And all those things are going to be different. They're going to be dynamic. There's going to be an actor on the other side in China and its sphere actively combating those things and trying to find ways, as we talked about with fentanyl, trying to find ways around export restrictions and the controls that those governments put in place. So as companies are living in this environment, they're going to need the ability to rapidly identify points in their supply chain that may one day be totally legal and the next not be, right? And it may not be something that is readily apparent as an immediate supplier, maybe 7 or 8 tiers down, right? When you're Volkswagen and you're importing Porsches into the United States, you don't want to find out when it gets to the border of Los Angeles that you can't bring the car into the United States because it had parts made in Xinjiang, right? You would think that large companies would have this level of awareness of their supply chains, and frankly, they don't, because we haven't had to for a lot of years, right? Most of the last 30 years is just in time. You get the cheapest product, you buy it in bulk, and you move it to your manufacturing facility, and it just goes on as this giant chain, and eventually you get an end product, right? That's not the environment we live in anymore, and it's going to get worse before it gets any better. So without AI, without the ability, as we talked about, to hit the mold before it comes up, you're going to be left behind. And what you're going to find is companies are struggling to get their products to market because they're not aware of how their supply chains are routing parts to provide components.
Go ahead, John.
Just to add on to that, and I think Ike really describes the way the changing matrix of government efforts to create their own economic security and protect their own national interests is playing out in the supply chains. That's the direct manifestation of the stuff that I was talking about a minute ago. And it's really important to think about these laws in 2 specific ways and what they require of businesses in kind of a new paradigm. So for decades, the idea was just more liberalization, free flow of goods. Everyone's going to be great. Everyone's going to be happy. Everyone's going to be prosperous. That is obviously not how it worked out. And so what you're seeing now is governments seek to, again, protect their interests, create economic security for themselves, and also impose their values, is a wave of new regulations, thousands and thousands. I think I saw an IMF Bloomberg chart that there were 1,300 in 2023 alone, that are characterized by 2 things. They're, one, extraterritorial in nature. So they say, if you want to do business inside our borders, we're going to impose an obligation about your behavior outside our borders. You've got to do stuff outside your borders, the way you behave, who your counterparties are, who you deal with, as a license to do business inside our borders. That's number 1. And number 2, they require essentially networked compliance. So it's not that it's no longer the case that, hey, Ike sells me something and that's all I got to know. I got to know Ike sold me something, but to make that, he bought it from my colleague Scott over there, who bought it from his colleague here in the front row, whose name I don't know, but so on and so forth. And you've got to be able to see that multi-tiered connection in your entire value chain, not just the business relationship, but the product flows from one supplier to the next that directly contribute to the end state product that you then want to import inside the borders of country that's opposed to these laws. So it's a really new paradigm for business.
And I think one other complexity is the fact that you are, the trend is to combine manufacturing facilities to, create economies of scale, right? So if you're Volkswagen, to, expand this example, you want to use your Xinjiang factory as much as possible because it's the most profitable to keep all your manufacturing there. Well, you got to know, if I'm moving, a engine that was made in that factory to the United States, it can't go there, but I can move it somewhere in China or somewhere else in the global south or Russia or wherever else it's going to be sold. So not only are you having to understand where you're buying things from, you're having to understand where individual components in your supply chain, which you are making, are moving within your proprietary supply chain. And I think some companies get that, and I think there is certainly a move to get that level of real-time intelligence. But it is, especially with multinationals and global span of these companies, it can only be done with AI because the level of data and the speed it moves is just too fast.
And does China get it?
Oh, I think China gets it better than we do.
So what are they going to do about your ability to check?
Absolutely. No, I think this is your
Of
point
course.
about Xinjiang or fentanyl that we've already started to see at Exeger. One of the big things we do is UFLPA compliance and some of the fentanyl precursors. And, we're already seeing the move just with UFLPA to say, hey, we're not going to give it directly to, China to US. It's going to go through Vietnam or Malaysia and then to Mexico and then up to the United States. That's still a UFLPA violation, right? But it's obfuscating the fact this is a dynamic adversary that's going to
And another reason you need AI, because
Right.
only AI can be trained to find those patterns and identify that evasion through transshipment in order to enforce the law against it.
Thank you. I can sense that we're already in a really good discussion, which is great. And where this takes me, the word complexity has come up a few times, and obviously this is the problem that we're all grappling with, a highly complex system of global supply chains that we need to have some oversight of, we need to have some control over. And it's not only that it's highly complex, it's also that it's not static, it's constantly changing and evolving, and it constantly changes and evolves in response to the policy changes that we impose on it, right? So we look at it and we say, we don't like this structure, this complex structure, therefore we're going to have a bunch of regulations and so on and compliance regimes that are aimed at changing that structure or mitigating the risks that flow from that structure. But the structure itself changes in response to that and regrows around. It takes me to other complex systems like the brain, right? The pattern of synapses in the brain, and you can cut off a little part of it. You can suspend the processing of one thought between one part of the brain and another, and another pattern will grow around it, right? Almost in real time that will happen. And that's exactly the problem we're facing here. And that's why AI, as I understand it, is essential, because we're just too slow for those complex processes. But one thing I am bothered about is we're very good, and maybe AI is good, at parsing and analyzing the things that we can see, the things that are in the pool of light, the things that we're focusing on. But I'm bothered about the things that we can't see, that we're not looking at, which are probably multiples of the size of the things we can see and much less well understood. And it's in that area, the shadow area that we can't see, that the new connections are going to grow. And I feel like I would like a solution that got me shed light on that whole structure. Is that what is on offer, do you think? Or do we have the capacity to do that?
Absolutely. And again, this is what technology unlocks. It's the ability to try and find the things that people are hiding from you. If you have enough data, if you are diverse, timely, and accurate in your data sources, behavior is more difficult to hide than records. So while it's important to look down your supply chain, who's connected to who, they all might be lying. If you look at behavior manufacturing, behavior, the evaluation of goods, the origin of goods, the quality of goods, the wider that you check, the more difficult it comes to hide. So AI allows us not just to look at everything quickly, it also allows us to say, what doesn't make sense? And therefore is likely hiding something else.
You know how people are good at pattern recognition and spot problems and anomalies because they have a sophisticated processing system called a brain, and they see things and they find patterns. But AI does pattern recognition, from the top of the atmosphere all the way down. And so you take fentanyl that we were talking about. How do you find the shipment of illegal fentanyl precursors, right? Fentanyl itself is a legal drug that has important uses in cancer care and other pain management. The precursors are all legal components that have important uses in lots of chemical and drug manufacture. How do you identify shipments that are obviously not labeled as, hey, illegal fentanyl precursor directed to my trafficking network?
And that's
It's
not
hidden.
all that those
Right.
things will do, right?
So how do you find that? You train your AI models on millions and millions and millions of data points of legal chemical companies transmitting and shipping those precursors in legal ways to understand what legal looks like and create a pattern recognition system that can then unearth anomalies and give you high confidence that this thing may not be what it pretends to be or what it purports to be. And that's really where the power of AI comes into play here, and how it can see the gaps that no human can see. Because all those billions of data points through which we're rendering this information, their behavior, they represent the movement of a thing from one place to another. It's not just a piece of data. It is a piece of data that represents actual humans doing things. And so the AI can sit astride all of that and really detect the anomalies and recognize the patterns.
Yeah, I think the to kind of bring this back to the government a little bit. Like you see 3 companies up here. There are a host of companies here doing similar things with AI at the speed of at the speed of business, right? To your point about humans do things slowly. When you put a bunch of humans together and you put them in government, they do things even slower. So the fact that we have the governments across the world laying on these restrictions, but they're not using the tools that are necessary to make informed decisions. So what you end up having is a host of businesses trying to conduct sale across multiple jurisdictions that have different regulatory regimes, while those things are in flux in themselves and they're not being dynamic in a way that actually achieves the intent that the policies are trying to get after, right? So I think where the government needs to come to industry a little bit is to really bring in some of these technologies so that you could write policy in a way that is as dynamic as the problem. And right now, we're just not there.
Nowhere near. And that's a classic policy problem, right? Your government is a slow-moving entity that will design a great big sledgehammer that will land on the system about 5 years after that policy was first discussed, and by which time it's no longer relevant at all. You're just going to hurt a bunch of people, and life has moved on. How you design a nimble, rapid policy structure, I mean, that who knows? That's a hard problem, right?
I have a very funny Hillary Clinton sledgehammer story that if you come to our booth later, I'll tell you.
But usually what takes a very long time is the point from policy to implementation. And what AI does allows it to shorten the time. So policy is in place. It's just the enforcement is impossible because of the volume of trade and the complexity of the network. AI allows us, the new technologies around here allow us to mitigate this gap. So once the policy is in place, the enforcement is immediate and effective.
Speaking for myself, I'm not 100% clear. In fact, I'm substantially less than 100% clear as to what the policy objectives are in this space. Apologies to those of you who are in policy circles, but it's not clear to me really what the government are trying to achieve. We talk about, is it decoupling? No, it's not. It's something less than that. Is it de-risking as the Europeans have it? Liza, you were talking about that earlier. Perhaps that's it. But if it is, it hasn't been articulated clearly, to my knowledge, in government. And what do we mean by de-risking? It seems to me there's at least 2 things that we might mean. One of which is if you're the US, for example, you don't want your industry or your military specifically to be dependent on supplies of critical materials from a potentially hostile power. You want to de-risk your relationship like that, to cut those supply chains. That's one dimension of de-risking. But another one is you don't want that potentially hostile power to have access to the technologies that you guys are producing, and we're all producing in the West. That's another kind of de-risking. Both of those, the intention of the de-risking policy, it sometimes seems to me like they are. It sometimes seems like they aren't. Like it's really just don't import that stuff from China. If that's it, okay, that's a clear policy framework. But is it the other one? If I were making policy, I think it should be the other one too. And then how do we think about that? Do people on the panel, do you feel like the policy framework, the framing of what we're trying to achieve is clear or no?
I think in certain cases it is. I mean, I think the semiconductor industry has certainly felt this, very uniquely over the last 5 to 6 years. But I think we're just beginning to understand. I mean, you keep turning over rocks and you keep finding bad stuff, right? We're sort of doing it rock by rock, right? We haven't actually set out. The government hasn't actually set out to say like, what are our actual dependencies? How many things of this type are we buying from China, and therefore how many could be cut off in the event of a conflict? I mean, I think that's where you don't necessarily need AI to make policy, but you certainly could use AI to at least identify the scope of the problem.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that Ike is making. That, as I started, I think there's, and you kind of articulated some of this too, I think there's a general notion that some of this is related to creating economic security and protecting national security. And some of it is really values-based. We don't want to live in a world where there's slave labor. Sometimes there's overlap. And so that's articulated. But beneath that, the idea of a kind of comprehensive industrial policy that has economic security at its heart, and here's how we'll achieve it, that blueprint is not there.
And I'm not sure we'll ever get there,
No,
right?
I
Because
agree with you
this is
about
the
that, too.
constraints of a democracy. We don't have that good policy.
And so instead, what I think all of us are trying to do in one way or another is to create modalities that allow for the protection of that economic security through information sharing and transparency that, with the clarity it brings, creates an opportunity for trust across counterparties. And so at Altana, we talk a lot about trusted value chains, not even just trusted supply chains, but really understanding the provenance, the sourcing of the raw material, the intermediate processing, the distribution, the consumption, all the way through. Not just the business relationship. It's not just that Ike sells me something that I sell. Is Ike selling me something that I put into a product that I sell for import to the United States? That's the value chain component of it. And if we can bring that clarity and information to the economy as a whole, then we create a fabric and a framework for trust and security that does not necessarily require decoupling, but it does come with de-risking.
I
Thank
think
you.
to that question, you should look at the impact of these policies. How well did sanctions on North Korea, Iran, Russia worked out? So the session here is about the new norm, about the unexpected being the expected, about instability, about changes in trade policies and regulation. The existing framework is not working. It's not working because it's a policy designed for free and fair. Where your counterparts are ends to a mean. Everything's justified. So until there's an understanding that it's not an even playing field, and you should leverage the fact that you have an advantage in innovation, in technology, in the ability to make sure who you do business with, as long as that is not there, we're going to have the short end of the stick.
Interesting stuff. A couple of other questions that I'm going to fire at all three of you, if I may. The first one is, thank you to Liza for furnishing these questions. The macro geopolitical shifts that we pictured in that first diagram that we weren't anticipating maybe 5 or 10 years ago, are now a reality, at least in some degrees. Russia invading Ukraine and the tensions that arise in the Middle East, for example. For each of you, can you time your personal wake-up call that prompted the commitment of time and energy that you've all undertaken since then to find a tech solution to this mess of problems that we're talking about? When did that happen? What triggered it?
Yeah, so I know exactly when it was. It was 2010. I was a lieutenant in the Pentagon, and I heard about this thing called a DF-21. It was a anti-ship ballistic missile that could hit a ship at sea, of which I was a regular officer serving on, 1,000 miles from the coast. And it was a entire awakening of how the Chinese had sort of manipulated our IP, theft, for lack of a better transfer, to develop some very, very sophisticated weaponry that we thought were fictional, that were just throwing money down a hole. And when they demonstrated that capability, it was sort of okay, this is for real. This isn't the sort of Chinese military that we all think is like the backwater, sort of like Iraq, just on steroids. But that became a serious, very personal concern for me after that.
I'm going to do the opposite kind of thing, and instead of mark it to a point in time, make myself look old and talk about time and trend. So, I started my career very early in the Clinton White House and spent a long time there. And that, of course, was the height of all the promise of globalization. That democracies never go to war with each other, freer and freer trade, everything's going to be peaches and cream. And obviously it did not work out that way. And so it has been, and then I was in the Obama administration too, where the failures of globalization were, very clear and becoming increasingly so. So I would say kind of a combination of my career and the arc of it, and watching the now, I think, pretty naive promise that somehow geopolitical values-based differences would just somehow evaporate in the face of some element of geopolitical change. and a background also that brings technology together with national security that really makes this an exciting and meaningful place to affect change. And then kind of the point that we were all making about governments too, which is, we all up here spend a lot of time working with the government. But it is sometimes very clear that the way to help the government achieve its very legitimate goals is by using innovation in the private sector. And I'm saying that, very gently and with appreciation for the mission of all of our government partners. And I mean that.
So when I had to argue with my daughter about her intention to buy stuff on Temu, right? So the ability to buy stuff for $2.99 that you don't need and you're not going to use for an endless amount, that was probably the time when I realized that our need to educate consumers is just as important as our ability to enable regulators. We're all used to buying stuff that we don't need excessively without really understanding what is the price, which is not in US dollars. So for me, what we do is important in the sense that we're setting an infrastructure, not just for effective and legitimate trade, but consumption. And this is, I hope, will be the world in which my daughters will buy stuff that they actually need.
Dream on, man. However, we've got 3 and a bit minutes left. So one more question, if I may. Quick fire answers to one more question. If you get what you want, all 3 of you on the panel, if your propositions, your businesses are roaring successes, and similar businesses too, what will supply chains look like in 2030 in that environment? Say everything works out as you want it. Scroll forward to 2030. What's the world look like then? What does supply chains look like? As quick as you can.
Only in 3 minutes. So I would say it's probably going to be a bifurcated world where we have like real-time intelligence down to the individual component level, and companies are operating with that level of intelligence in their business decisions day to day.
That was really quick. That was like 3 seconds.
Look, people will have a comprehensive understanding of the provenance, processing, provenance, processing, and ultimate distribution of their products. They will know what goes into it, who touches it, how it's made, and they will be able to share that through systems that allow for common understanding and operating through common operating pictures so that they create this trust. So you will have a bifurcated system, but you have a system that I think will be much more efficient and will hopefully be more efficient at resource allocation. And, look, I'm an optimist. I've read science fiction my whole life, pretty much since I could read, except for maybe the JFK book I used to hide under my pillow when I was 4. But together, those things, like, that's how we reach change and we make progress. And it is the combination of the technology that we're seeing. This is why this is, all about competitiveness here. The technology we see in this room and working with our government partners to really drive to a more efficient, more productive, more fair result.
I think it will look like your first slide, right? That's the new norm. And there'll be different chains and networks and a lot more independence in our sourcing and manufacturing. And the outcome will be everything's going to be more expensive, but at least we know that we can rely on our sourcing.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, everybody. I think that's drawn us all of this to a conclusion. I think that was a fascinating discussion, certainly for me. So how are we going to navigate the new normal, folks? We're going to do it using AI, and you've got some people in front of you that can help you do exactly that thing. Thank you very much.
Please come check out all our booths.
Thank you so much to our wonderful speakers, Eric Britton of Fathom Consulting, Ron Benzian of Ultra Information Solutions, Jonathan Prince of Altana, and Ike Harris of Exeger. Please stop by and see their booths here on the floor, get to know them better, and thank all of you for attending.
Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.